Close your eyes and let your mind drift to ancient China. The cool evening breeze moves softly over the endless stone wall. Torches flicker in the distance, guarding the silent mountains. You walk slowly along the Great Wall, hearing only the whisper of the wind. Tonight, let's journey together through time, to the story of the Great Wall of China. The northern plains of ancient China stretched endlessly beneath a pale, colorless sky. The air was thin, sharp, and filled with the scent of frozen grass. Every winter, the wind came down from the steppes carrying not only snow but the ghosts of battles past, whispers of hooves, the distant cry of horns, and the faint echo of men who vanished long ago. In the border villages, people learned to listen carefully, for in the howling of the wind, one could almost hear the warning of what was to come. Each night, fires flickered weakly behind the mud brick walls. Families gathered close, sharing warmth and fear alike. Mothers told their children not to stray too far, their voices trembling as they spoke of riders from the north, fierce, shadowy men who struck under the cover of the storm. These were the Shilnu, masters of the steppe, swift as the wind and merciless as winter itself. The raids had become frequent, herds were stolen, granaries burned, and the silence of the plains was broken by screams. Farmers began to abandon their lands, retreating further south. But the wind carried every sound, and it seemed as though even the heavens had grown weary of the blood that stained the snow. The empire could no longer ignore the cries of its frontier. In the great city of Xianyang, where marble courtyards reflected the light of countless lanterns, the young Emperor Qin Shi Huang summoned his council. His advisors brought reports, maps marked with red ink, showing every village lost to northern raiders. The emperor listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the palace walls. He was not a man to accept weakness. Finally, he rose from his jade throne. "Then we shall build," he declared, his voice echoing across the hall, "a wall that will bind the mountains together. That will keep the wind and the riders it carries from reaching our people. A wall that will endure longer than fear itself." Messengers were sent to every corner of the empire. The decree spread like wildfire. Farmers, soldiers, and prisoners alike were to march north to build the Great Barrier. Across the valleys and deserts, men and women whispered the same words, "a wall." Some spoke them with hope, others with dread. None yet knew the price it would demand. In the borderlands, news arrived before the spring thaw. Old men sat in silence, staring at the horizon. "The mountains will not like this," they muttered. "The earth remembers those who cut its bones." But the young were eager. They dreamed of honor, of serving the emperor, of leaving their mark upon the world. By the time the first columns of workers began their journey, the snow had started to melt. The air smelled of cold soy and pine resin. The men carried shovels, picks, and dreams. Behind them, wives stood in the doorways, clutching children who didn't yet understand why their fathers had to go. Days turned into weeks as they marched across the northern wilderness. The path was long and harsh, rivers half frozen, hills steep and cruel. Some fell behind, swallowed by the cold. Others pressed on, driven by duty or fear of imperial punishment. At night they built fires that glowed faintly in the dark, tiny islands of light in a sea of frost. When they finally reached the chosen ridge, a long stretch of rock overlooking the endless plains, they saw imperial banners fluttering in the wind. Engineers marked the ground with bamboo poles, shouting orders. The first stones were hauled up, rough and heavy. Sweat met frost, and the sound of hammers echoed like thunder across the mountains. The wall began as nothing more than an uneven line of packed earth, but as the days turned into months, the line grew higher, stronger, winding across valleys and slopes like a serpent made of stone. From the distance, it looked alive, crawling slowly across the mountains as thousands of hands shaped it with pain and pride. The workers sang as they labored, songs of home and memory. Their voices rose and fell with the wind, blending with the cries of cranes that flew above. Some whispered prayers into the stones, hoping their families would hear them somehow. For many, this wall would become both their creation and their tomb. At night, the northern sky unfolded like a black sea filled with stars. The men lay on frozen ground, staring upward, wondering if their sacrifices would truly bring peace. The wind never slept. It moved through the cracks of the half-built wall, whispering secrets only the dead could understand. And yet, in that cold silence, there was hope, fragile but real. Hope that one day, the border villages would no longer burn. Hope that children would grow up never knowing fear. Hope that a wall built by suffering might one day protect the dreams of a nation. As dawn broke, light touched the stones and turned them golden. The workers rose, their breath misting in the air, and though their hands were raw and their hearts weary, they continued, because to stop would be to let the wind win. Thus, beneath the whisper of the northern winds, the great wall was born not from stone alone, but from the will of a people who refused to bow to the storm. The first dawn on the northern ridge came with a silence so deep that even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Frost clung to the workers' clothes, turning them into statues of ice before the day had even begun. They stood in lines, hundreds of them as soldiers, peasants, prisoners, and craftsmen bound by the same command, though their hearts carried very different reasons for being there. Some sought redemption, others survival, and a few, glory. The foremen shouted names, their voices breaking the morning stillness. Stones were counted, fuels distributed, and rations measured with ruthless precision. The empire demanded order, even here, where the world seemed to end. Each man was a cog in a vast machine that stretched across valleys and deserts, a machine built on sweat, fear, and faith. Among the workers was a man named Liang. Once a farmer from the southern plains, he had been taken by the imperial guards after failing to pay his grain tax. Now, he found himself in a land where even the sun felt cold. Each morning he lifted stones heavier than his regrets, his hands cracked and bleeding from frost and labor. Yet, as he worked, he watched the wall rise, line by line, and wondered if something so cruel could also be beautiful. At night, Liang sat by the fire with men from distant provinces, men who spoke different dialects but shared the same exhaustion. They traded stories about home, about rivers that never froze and fields that sang in the wind. One of them, an old stonemason named Han, told tales of walls built in ancient times, smaller, weaker, yet made with the same dream, protection. Han's voice trembled as he spoke, not from age, but from memory. The wall, he said, is not built to keep people out. It's built so that those within may sleep without fear. The others nodded silently, the flames reflecting in their tired eyes. For a moment, the biting cold faded, replaced by a warmth that came not from the fire, but from the thought that perhaps their suffering had meaning. When dawn returned, the hammers began again. The rhythm of work was like a heartbeat echoing through the mountains. Each blow shaped more than stone, it shaped destiny. The engineers marked new routes, and laborers hauled materials up impossible slopes. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though watching this monumental act of defiance against nature itself. As weeks turned into months, the wall stretched farther than the eye could see. Villages of tents grew near the construction sites. Women arrived with baskets of millet and herbs, caring for the wounded. Some men found love amidst the dust and hardship. Others buried their friends beneath unmarked stones. Life and death mingled here. Just as earth and sky met at the horizon, Liang began to feel a strange pride. Though his back ached and his hands could no longer close properly, he saw beauty in the order of the stones. Each one placed by a hand like his, each one part of something greater. Sometimes he whispered to the wall, as if it could hear him, our promises, apologies, and prayers carried away by the northern wind. But the work was merciless. The emperor's overseers arrived often, inspecting every section. Those who faltered were punished. Those who resisted were never seen again. Fear ruled the camps like a second commander, yet beneath that fear, something unbreakable persisted, the will to finish. In the evenings, as the sun sank behind the hills, the wall glowed like molten gold. The workers watched it stretch toward infinity, disappearing into the haze of snow. It no longer looked like a mere barrier. It looked like a living thing, breathing, growing, eternal. The old mason Han once said, "When this wall is complete, the wind will have to ask permission before crossing China." The men laughed, but quietly, because deep down they wanted to believe it. The wall had already begun to change them. They were no longer farmers, prisoners, or soldiers. They had become builders of history. And in the nights that followed, as frost turned the world silver and silence returned to the plains, the workers dreamed not of home, but of completion, somewhere beyond the reach of the stars. The gods watched their creation with quiet awe. The great wall was rising, stone by stone, heartbeat by heartbeat, under the frozen breath of the northern sky. The winter sun hung low over the northern plains, its pale light stretching across endless mounds of earth and snow. From dawn to dusk, thousands of men toiled in silence, their breaths turning into mist as they lifted stone after stone, log after log. The Great Wall was not one continuous stretch of defense, yet it was 1,000 fragments, scattered across the mountains and valleys of northern China, waiting to be united like pieces of a giant puzzle. Among the workers was Li Wen, a farmer from the fertile lands near the Yellow River. He had been conscripted along with his neighbors to serve the empire's cause. His hands, once used to holding a plow, were now covered in blisters from the rough stones. Each evening, as the cold wind howled and the fires crackled, he would think of his wife and child far away, wondering if they would ever see him again. The commanders rode along the unfinished wall on horseback, shouting orders that echoed through the valleys. Faster! The northern tribes grow restless. One barked, his fur cloak whipping in the wind. Rumors had spread that the Xiongnu riders had been sighted again near the frontier. Their swift horses and curved bows could strike terror in any soldier's heart. The wall, the emperor said, would be their shield. But the men knew it was not only a shield, it was a tomb for many. Avalanches claimed some, disease took others. Food was scarce, and water sometimes froze solid in their wooden barrels. At night, they huddled together in crude shelters made of mud and straw, whispering prayers to their ancestors. "Hold us through this winter," Li Wen murmured one night, his eyes fixed on the flickering flame of a small oil lamp. As months passed, the wall began to rise not from magic or miracle, but from sweat, tears, and the quiet determination of countless forgotten souls. Each brick was carried on shoulders that trembled, each section completed by hands that bled. The wall grew not only from the ground but from the sacrifices buried beneath it. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the man behind this monumental vision, rarely saw the suffering himself. In his palace far to the south, he read reports of progress and delays, his mind consumed by the dream of uniting all of China under one rule, one language, one law, one wall. To him, this was destiny. To the workers, it was endurance. And yet, for all the hardship, there were moments of quiet beauty. At dusk, the sun would set behind the mountains, bathing the half-built wall in a golden glow. The men would stop, lean on their shovels, and gaze at the endless horizon. "It looks like a dragon," someone would whisper. "A dragon guarding the heart of China." And in that moment, despite the pain, pride would swell in their chests. Still, winter was merciless. The snow thickened, and the icy wind became a living thing that clawed at their faces. Some nights, the fires wouldn't stay lit, and the men would sleep beside the stones they laid that day. using them as a shield against the cold. In the distance, wolves howled, a haunting chorus that seemed to mock their struggle. One morning, Li Wen awoke to find the man beside him frozen stiff, his eyes open, staring at the unfinished wall. They buried him beneath the same earth they had spent months moving, marking the grave with a single stone. Another piece of the wall, one worker muttered, his voice breaking. But despite everything, the wall continued to grow slow, steady, and unstoppable. Word spread through the empire of the emperor's great work. A endless line of stone stretching toward the clouds. Traders from the Silk Road spoke of it, in awe, calling it a wonder of men and gods alike. And so the winter passed, then another, and another. The wall snaked over hills and through valleys, binding together the sweat of peasants, the dreams of emperors, and the bones of the fallen. It was no longer just a defense, it had become a symbol of endurance, unity, and sacrifice. And in the deep stillness of the night, as snowflakes settled gently on the stones, Li Wen would close his eyes and think, perhaps one day my son will walk upon this wall. Perhaps he will know that his father was here, a small part of something greater. The wind of the northern steppes never truly rested. It swept across the frozen grasslands, carrying with it the cries of eagles and the whisper of hooves, beyond the rising wall, beyond the emperor's dream of unity. The Xiongnu tribes lived and rode, a people born of open skies and endless horizons. Their leader, a man named Modu Chanyu, had heard of the wall, this strange line of stone that the southern emperor had raised like a barrier against the sky. Some said it was a mark of fear, others, a challenge. For the Xiongnu, who had always roamed free, it was both. To them, no wall could stop the wind or tame the wild heart of the steppe. Modu would ride to the highest ridges, his fur cloak snapping behind him, and look south. From there, he could see the faint shadow of the great wall twisting along the mountains. They think they can keep us out, he said to his son Tuglu. But walls do not change the sky. Tuglu, still young but sharp-eyed, nodded silently. He had never seen cities or palaces, only the wide earth and the herds that gave them life. That winter, the steppes were cruel. Snow buried the grass, and the herds grew thin. The Xiongnu clans gathered around great fires, their shamans chanting to the spirits of wind and ancestors. They spoke of omens, of a world that was changing, of an empire to the south growing stronger than ever before. The wall, said an elder, is not built from stone alone. It is built from fear. And fear spreads faster than frost. But among the Xiongnu, not all were eager for war. Some, like the young woman Arguna, had seen the suffering that followed raids, burning homes, lost children, hungry winters. She would ride her horse near the wall sometimes, watching the distant figures of Chinese workers moving like ants along the ridges. She wondered if they, too, were simply obeying orders, surviving one day at a time. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Arguna noticed a figure on the other side of the valley. It was a lone man, wrapped in rags, gathering firewood. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, hers filled with curiosity, his with exhaustion. Neither spoke, yet something passed between them, something human and fragile. Then the wind rose, and the moment was gone. Meanwhile, within the emperor's court, news arrived of Xiongnu movement near the frontier. They are testing the wall, said one advisor. Send reinforcements. The emperor, seated upon his jade throne, merely nodded. Let them come. The wall will stand. His voice was calm, but deep within, he knew the wall was not yet whole. There were still gaps, miles of open land where the northern riders could pour through like water. And so the skirmishes began. Small groups of Xiongnu would descend at night, swift as shadows, attacking supply wagons and disappearing before dawn. The soldiers guarding the wall grew weary. their nerves stretched thin by the endless cold and uncertainty. Li Wen, now hardened by years of labor, was among them. He had laid stones once, now he guarded them. On a night colder than most, Li Wen stood watch along a newly completed section. The moonlight turned the snow silver, and the silence was so deep that he could hear his own heartbeat. Then, far away, a faint rumble of hooves. He tensed, gripping his spear. Figures emerged from the darkness, riders, fast and silent. The alarm was sounded. Torches flared, arrows whistled through the air, and the calm of the night shattered like glass. The clash was brief but fierce. When it was over, the snow was stained red, and the riders vanished back into the steppes. Li Wen knelt beside a fallen soldier, pressing a hand to his wound, but it was too late. The man's last breath rose in the freezing air and vanished like mist. In the following days, the emperor's messengers rode north, carrying new orders. Strengthen the wall. Extend it higher, wider, longer. Let no shadow pass unchallenged. The work began anew, even more relentless than before. The laborers groaned, the soldiers dug trenches, and the sound of hammers once again filled the mountains, yet the Xiongnu did not disappear. They watched from afar, patient as the snow itself. Let them build, said Modu. For every wall they raise, we will find another path. The sky has no borders. And as the years went by, the Great Wall stretched further, the line between two worlds, between two peoples who did not truly understand each other, yet were bound by the same winds. The same winters, the same longing to survive. The emperor sat alone in his grand hall, the sound of crackling braziers echoing softly against the carved stone walls. Outside, the winter winds moaned through the palace corridors. Carrying the scent of pine and ash, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, gazed into the flames, seeing not fire but vision, a dream of eternity. 4 years he had conquered kingdoms, crushed rebellions, and united the warring states beneath a single banner. But now, as the empire stretched from the southern seas to the northern steppes, his mind turned toward something for greater permanence. Empires rise and fall, he had once told his ministers, but my China shall endure for 10,000 generations. To achieve that, he ordered the unification of the walls, the countless fortifications built by the former states of Qin, Zhou, and Yan, into one continuous barrier. Let no barbarian cross our northern gate, he commanded. And so the Great Wall was born, not from one man's dream, but from the fear and ambition of an emperor who sought to outlast time itself. At night, Qin Shi Huang could not sleep. He would rise from his silk bed and walk through the silent halls of his palace, past statues of dragons and tigers carved from jade. His physicians had given him potions, elixirs of mercury and gold, said to grant eternal life, but still, his body ached, his heart heavy with the weight of destiny. If I am to rule forever, he thought, I must build something that never dies. And so, the wall became his obsession. Reports came daily of progress in the east, collapses in the west, riots in the north. Thousands of lives were swallowed by the project. But to him they were numbers on the scroll. Ink fading beneath his fingertips, he believed the suffering was necessary, a small sacrifice for the glory of eternity. In his dreams, the wall was alive. It stretched across the mountains like a dragon of stone, its scales gleaming beneath the sun. It breathed, it moved, it protected. And when he awoke, sweating beneath his silks, he would whisper, "The wall must stand, even when I do not." His closest advisor, Li Si, once dared to ask, "Your Majesty, will the wall truly keep the northern tribes away?" The emperor's eyes, sharp as blades, met his. "It will keep their fear at bay. That is enough." Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls famine spread. Fields lay barren where men had been conscripted to labor on the wall. Families starved, Mothers wept. Children vanished into the endless work camps of the north, but the emperor rarely heard their cries. His world was filled with scrolls and reports, not voices. One day, a messenger arrived from the frontier. His robes were torn, his face burned by frost. He knelt before the emperor, trembling. "Your Majesty," he said, "the wall grows, but so do the graves. Entire villages have been emptied. The men die faster than the stones can be laid." For a long moment, Qin Shi Huang said nothing. Then he rose from his throne and walked to the window. Outside, the snow fell softly over the capital, coating the roofs like pale ash. "When a tree grows tall," he said finally, "its roots must go deep. If the roots die, the tree falls. If the people die, the empire falls. See that this does not happen." He dismissed the messenger with a wave, but his words lingered in the air like ghosts. That night, the emperor dreamed again, this time, not of the wall, but of the people buried beneath it. He saw faces without names, eyes filled with silent reproach. He reached out to them, but they turned to dust. He awoke before dawn, his hands trembling. From that day forward, Qin Shi Huang became even more withdrawn. He built secret tunnels beneath his palace, connecting his chambers to the gardens and towers. He trusted no one, not even his own sons. He feared assassination, rebellion, and the slow decay of all he had built. The wall, he told himself, was his salvation. It would hold back not just enemies, but time itself. Years passed. The emperor's health waned, yet his ambition burned brighter than ever. He ordered more men, more stone, more lives. The great wall crept further across the land like a living scar, vast and yielding, magnificent. And one evening, as the sun set over the western mountains, the emperor stood upon a newly finished section. The wind tore through his robes, and the horizon seemed endless. For the first time in years, he smiled. "This," he whispered, "is my immortality." But the wind, ever untamed, carried his words northward across the plains, over the camps of the dead, to the riders of the steppe who still watched and waited, and somewhere beyond the reach of the wall, the world continued to move, indifferent to the dreams of emperors. The northern wind blew like a whisper from the endless steppes, brushing across the unfinished stones of the wall. Each gust carried with it the scent of dust, frost, and sweat. The Great Wall of China was not a single line of stone, it was 1,000 miles of human struggle. Every block carried the weight not only of the empire's ambition but also of the countless lives that shaped it. At dawn, the sky turned pale gray, and the camps along the wall came alive. Soldiers blew their horns, rousing the sleeping workers from their makeshift tents. The men stirred slowly, limbs stiff from the cold, backs aching from the previous day's labor. Their hands were blistered, their feet cracked and raw, yet the moment the horn sounded, they rose. It was not courage that moved them, but duty and fear of the soldiers who watched over them. Li Wei, once a humble mason from Hunan, had been working here for months. The calluses on his hands had turned to hardened scars, his voice now hoarse from breathing the dust of ground stone. Every morning, he looked at the mountain range that stretched before him and wondered if the wall would ever truly end. The engineers said it would connect heaven and earth. But to Li Wei, it felt more like a prison, built stone by stone. The work was endless. Large stones were dragged up steep slopes using ropes and wooden rollers. Oxen groaned under the weight, men shouted and strained, sweat freezing on their skin. If a rope snapped, the stone would tumble back down, crushing whoever stood in its path. The screams echoed through the valley, and the overseers would blow their horns again, ordering the men to continue. There was no pause for grief. The empire could not afford to slow. At night, the fires along the camps flickered like stars fallen to earth. Men huddled close for warmth, sharing bowls of thin millet gruel. Conversation was rare. Exhaustion made silence their only language. Some prayed to their ancestors, whispering hopes that their spirits would watch over them. Others stared into the flames, their thoughts lost in memories of distant homes and faces they might never see again. The harshest months were winter. Snow covered the mountains, turning the world white and merciless. Tools froze in their hands, and even the fires could not chase away the cold. Some men died quietly in their sleep, frost stiffening their limbs before dawn. In the morning, their bodies were buried beneath the stones they had carried the day before. "Let them guard the wall," one soldier murmured once, and no one spoke against him. But amid the suffering, there was also resilience. The workers learned to move as one, their rhythm synchronized like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Songs began to rise above the clatter of tools, slow, mournful melodies that told of home, love, and loss. Even the soldiers, hardened as they were, sometimes listened in silence, their expressions softening in the glow of the campfires. One evening, Liu watched the sunset bleed across the horizon, turning the sky the color of burning copper. "Will anyone remember us?" he asked quietly. His friend Chen, a farmer turned laborer, smiled weakly. "The emperor will be remembered," he said. "But perhaps the wall will remember us." Liu nodded, feeling the truth in those words. Stones had a way of keeping secrets. The foreman often spoke of progress, of glory, of uniting the empire. But to those who built it, glory meant survival. Another day, another sunrise. The wall crept higher, its shadow stretching farther each week. Villages near the construction sites emptied as more men were conscripted. Women and children watched the caravans leave, unsure if their husbands or fathers would ever return. Sometimes, Liu thought of escaping, slipping away into the mountains under cover of night. But the land was vast and cruel, and the soldiers patrolled constantly. He had heard of deserters caught and buried alive within the foundations. The wall must stand firm, the overseers would say, even if it must be built on bones. Still, the wall grew, day after day, stone upon stone. The line extended toward the horizon like a scar carved into the earth. It was said that when finished, it would stretch across deserts, rivers, and mountains visible even from the heavens. To the empire, it was a monument of power. To the builders, it was the weight of generations. Years passed, faces changed, commanders came and went, but the work continued. The wall was eternal, and those who built it became part of its eternity. Their names were forgotten, their graves unmarked, yet their hands shaped history. The stones they lifted still stand today, silent and unyielding, bearing witness to their suffering and strength. And when the wind blows across the Great Wall, it is said to carry their whispers the sighs of men who once gave their lives to hold back the northern winds. The morning sun rose pale over the mountains, spilling light across the newly laid stones. Along the northern stretches of the Great Wall, soldiers stood at watchtowers, their eyes scanning the endless horizon. They were young and old alike, conscripted from villages hundreds of miles away, tasked with guarding a structure that seemed to stretch into eternity. Each watchtower was a small fortress of wood and stone. From there, a soldier could signal warnings with smoke by day and fire by night. Communication was slow, reliant on line of sight and practiced signals. When a rider from the Xiongnu appeared on the distant steps, the watchers would raise their flags and torches, sending the message down the line, "They come, prepare." The men endured freezing temperatures and biting winds. Frost clung to their hair and eyebrows, icicles forming on their cloaks. Some nights, the snowstorm was so severe that the horizon vanished entirely. In those moments, a single shout could carry only a few feet. The soldiers huddled close to the walls, trying to stay awake and alert, relying on each other's warmth and presence. Among them was a young man named Gao, barely 16, who had been taken from his village to serve as a watchman. He had never seen a city before, only rolling hills and distant mountains. At first, fear had gripped him, the vastness of the wall, the responsibility of watching for threats, the loneliness of night. But slowly, he learned the rhythm of the stones and the wind. He could read the clouds, interpret the movement of distant figures, and anticipate danger long before it arrived. Days blurred into nights, and nights into days. The wall became both prison and sanctuary. Soldiers wrote letters to families they would never see, etched their names into the stone, and shared small gifts: a bowl of rice, a piece of cloth, a warm piece of dried meat. It was a fragile humanity that persisted amid endless labor and vigilant eyes. When the Xiongnu approached, they did so with caution. Small groups tested the defenses, looking for weaknesses. Arrows flew, and horns sounded along the wall. Some skirmishes were brief. Others lasted hours. For the watchers, every encounter was a lesson in patience and endurance. Lives were lost, and yet the wall held. Mile after mile, silent and steadfast. Over time, the young soldiers developed a rhythm, a shared understanding of the land, the seasons, and the people they defended against. They observed how the steppes shifted with the wind, how snowfall masked the approach of riders, and how dawn revealed threats that had hidden in darkness. The wall was more than stones; it was a tool, a sentinel, and a testament to the labor of countless hands. Despite the hardships, there were moments of quiet beauty. Sunsets painted the mountains gold and crimson. Birds traced paths along the ridges. The wind, harsh and unyielding, also carried the scent of pine and the distant rivers. Gao sometimes paused to watch the landscape, feeling a strange peace amid the tension. It reminded him of home, of the fields and rivers he had left behind. The nights were the hardest. Moonlight on snow turned the world ghostly white. Shadows stretched across the stones, and every sound was magnified. A wolf's howl could send a shiver through a watchtower. The crack of an ice-laden branch a warning of a possible attack. Yet soldiers learned to find rhythm in the stillness of breathing, watching, and counting the hours until dawn. Through the years, the wall grew higher, longer, and stronger. Soldiers came and went, but the watchers remained a constant presence. They were the eyes of the empire, the first line of warning, and the silent guardians of thousands of lives. Their vigilance allowed the empire to thrive, to expand, and to maintain order, even as the northern steppes remained untamed and unpredictable. And when centuries later the wall would still stand, the traces of these watchers, their footsteps, their whispers, their silent sacrifices, would remain woven into its stones. A quiet testimony to those who gave themselves to the endless horizon. The sun had risen countless times over the northern mountains, and the Great Wall of China had stood through wars, storms, and shifting empires. By now, the men who had built it were gone, their faces lost to history, their voices carried only by the stones they had set in place. Yet the wall remained, silent and enduring, a testament to human labor and ambition. Villages near the wall had grown into towns, then cities. Traders followed the routes beside the stones, bringing silk, salt, and ideas from distant lands. The watchtowers still stood, though many were abandoned, and soldiers still patrolled some stretches, ensuring that the northern borders remained guarded. The wall had become more than a defense; it was a corridor of civilization, a line marking the edge of empire and the beginning of the unknown. Travelers and scholars marveled at its length and scale. They wrote about the mountains it crossed, the rivers it bridged, and the ingenuity of its construction. The mortar, made from sticky rice and lime, had hardened over centuries, defying weather and time. Stones laid by hands long gone continued to hold the earth together, a memory embedded in every block. Local legends grew around the wall, but they were grounded in truth. People remembered the sacrifices of the workers, the harsh winters, the endless labor, and the young soldiers who kept watch under the cold and wind. Families told stories of fathers and sons who had contributed to the great structure, passing down tales of courage and endurance. In the spring, wildflowers grew between the stones, and birds nested in the watchtowers. The northern winds continued to blow, but the wall now seemed less like a line of fear and more like a companion to the land. It shaped the horizon, directed travelers, and stood as a reminder of what human determination could achieve. Even distant emperors who came after Qin Shi Huang knew the significance of what had been built. It was no longer only a military defense but a symbol of unity. A ribbon tying together disparate lands and peoples under a single empire. Its presence shaped diplomacy, trade, and even the cultural imagination of generations to come. Historians centuries later would measure its stones and trace its path, marveling at the scale and coordination it required. They would read the reports of the laborers, the soldiers, and the overseers, understanding how fear, duty, and ambition had intertwined to create something enduring. The wall was a record of human persistence, written not on paper, but on mountains and plains. Li Wei's name was lost to the world, but the work of his hands remained. Gao's watch over the northern horizon was now legend, a reflection of the countless unnamed watchers who had kept the empire safe. Every stone told a story. Every mile echoed the lives of those who had endured beyond the reach of history books. By the time empires rose and fell again, the wall had grown into a timeless witness. It had seen traders, armies, and travelers pass by. It had felt the frost of winter, the heat of summer, and the endless whisper of the northern winds. And still, it endured, connecting the past to the present, telling a story of human endeavor, resilience, and vision. The Great Wall was no longer just stone and mortar. It was a legacy of sacrifice, of labor, of ambition, and of the enduring human spirit. And when the wind sweeps across its length, it carries with it the whispers of men and women long gone, a quiet reminder that history is built not only by emperors, but by all who dare to labor, endure, and dream. The years passed slowly, marked by the rhythm of hammers and the sigh of the wind that swept through the mountains. The Great Wall, now stretching endlessly across the rugged land, had begun to look less like a construction site and more like a monument. Its stones gleamed faintly under the pale sun, and travelers from distant provinces came to see the immense creation with their own eyes. Yet for those who lived and worked there, the wall was not a wonder, it was life itself. The laborers, once numbering in the tens of thousands, were fewer now. The great construction had consumed so many lives that entire villages had vanished, their names remembered only by the few who still whispered them at night. Those who remained were seasoned men, their hands hardened like the stones they laid, their faces lined by wind, dust, and time. Each morning began the same, the sound of wooden horns calling the workers from their tents, the clatter of tools, the distant bark of orders. They carried stones up steep paths, fitted them into place, and mixed mortar with hands that trembled from exhaustion. The wall no longer grew fast, it grew carefully, each section strengthened to endure the centuries to come. Soldiers kept watch along the completed stretches, standing tall against the horizon. Their armor had dulled, their spears chipped, but their eyes were sharp as ever. They watched the plains beyond, the endless steppe, where nomadic riders still roamed. The old fear of invasion had faded but never vanished. Every now and then, a column of smoke on the horizon reminded them that peace was fragile. At night, fires burned along the wall, a string of flickering lights stretching for miles. Around these fires, the workers and soldiers gathered. They shared rice wine when they could, sang songs of home, and told stories of the emperor's vision. of lost brothers, of how the wall itself seemed to hum with the voices of the dead. Some believe that the spirits of the fallen guarded the wall, watching from the mountain peaks. The older soldiers spoke of earlier days, of the fear when the first Mongol raid swept through, of the cold winters that froze entire patrols in their posts. The younger men listened, eyes wide, wondering whether they too would become part of those tales one day. The wall had made them one. Soldier, laborer, craftsman, all united by sweat and stone. In the nearby valleys, life had begun to return. Markets appeared near the camps, merchants selling tea tools and cloth to weary men. Small villages grew where once there had been only dust. Children played in the shadow of the wall, their laughter echoing between its towers. For the first time in decades, there was a sense that life was possible again, not just survival, but living. The seasons still ruled everything. Spring brought hope, green shoots along the slopes and gentle winds that smelled of earth. Summer burned the stones until they glowed, and even the strongest men sought shade. Autumn covered the mountains in gold and red, while winter silenced all freezing rivers, stiffening fingers, turning breath into mist. The wall stood through it all, a silent witness to the passing years. By now, the emperor who had ordered its construction was long gone. His name remained carved in stone, but time had already begun to smooth the edges. The workers rarely spoke of him anymore. For them, the wall was no longer the emperor's will, it was their creation, a testament to their endurance, their suffering, and their stubborn will to build something that would outlast them all. As the final stones were placed and the last towers sealed, an eerie quiet descended on the camps. There was no great celebration, only silence and a strange sadness. The wall was finished. The men who had given their lives to it stood before it and felt both pride and emptiness. The task that had defined their years was over, and now they had only themselves left. On a calm evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the wall seemed to glow like a golden serpent stretching into eternity. Birds circled above, and wind whispered along the battlements. The men stood still, listening. In that moment, they understood this was not the end. The wall would live on, carrying their stories, their voices, and their struggles in every stone. Years passed since the final stone was laid. The great wall stood firm, stretching like a sleeping dragon across mountains, valleys, and deserts. The soldiers who once built it now guarded it, their children playing where their fathers once toiled. Yet even as peace seemed to reign, the wall began to hear whispers carried by the northern wind, whispers of riders gathering again beyond the horizon. The steppes beyond the wall were never truly silent. Out there, among the grass seas and frozen rivers, tribes still roamed, fierce, proud, and hungry for new lands. They called themselves by many names, and their horses moved like storms. Word reached the wall's garrisons that scouts had seen smoke rising from camps deep in the north. The message was clear: peace was a guest that never stayed long. Inside the towers, the commanders gathered. Maps covered their tables, marked with red ink and broken lines. Old veterans remembered the last time the riders came swift as wind, striking without warning. "We have a wall now," one said. "But a wall is only as strong as the men who guard it." And so, preparations began once more. The armories were opened, arrows sharpened, fires rekindled in the watchtowers. Farmers living near the frontier sent their families south, while young men took up spears and joined the garrisons. The Great Wall, which had once been a monument to endurance, now became a shield once again. When the first snows fell, silence blanketed the mountains. The soldiers on the wall could see their breath turning to mist, could hear nothing but the wind. Then one morning, a scout rode in exhausted, bleeding, his horse covered in frost. "They are coming," he gasped. "Hundreds. No, thousands of them." Trumpets echoed along the wall. From tower to tower, The warning fires blazed, each flame calling to the next. Within hours, the entire frontier was alive with light. A serpent of fire slithering across the mountains. The wall, once silent, now roared like a living thing. As the nomadic riders appeared from the mist, their banners fluttering, their cries piercing the cold air, the soldiers took their places. Archers lined the battlements, their bows drawn, their hearts pounding below them. The riders gathered like dark waves before the storm. Then came the sound of drums, deep, thunderous drums rolling from beyond the plains. The riders surged forward, shouting more cries that echoed off the stone. Arrows flew, striking shields, armor, and flesh. The clash of iron and the screams of battle filled the air. The Great Wall, centuries old, faced its trial once again. For days, the attacks continued. The riders would come at dawn and vanish by night. The soldiers, weary and sleepless, fought on, holding their ground. The wall was scarred by fire and blood, but it stood unbroken. At last, on the fifth morning, the horizon was empty again. The northern wind carried away the smoke and the cries, leaving only silence and the smell of ash. The soldiers leaned on their spears, too tired to cheer. They had survived, but at a great cost. When spring returned, the wall's wounds were mended. Stones were replaced, gates repaired. Fresh banners flew again over the towers. But something had changed. The soldiers knew now that the wall was not merely stone. It was alive, fed by the courage and sacrifice of those who guarded it. That night, under a sky full of stars, an old commander stood atop the highest tower. He looked north, where the steppes stretched endlessly into the darkness. "They will come again," he whispered. "But so will we." And in that quiet moment, as the wind brushed against the stones, the Great Wall seemed to breathe, not as a barrier, but as a heartbeat of a nation that refused to fall. Centuries flowed like rivers past the stones of the Great Wall. Empires rose and fell. Kings were crowned and buried. Yet the wall remained a silent, steadfast, ancient. It had become more than a line of defense. It was the spine of a civilization. A monument not to war, but to endurance. Travelers who approached it for the first time always stopped and stared. The stones seemed to hum with the voices of those who had laid them, the builders, the soldiers, the nameless thousands who had labored beneath the burning sun and frozen stars. Some said, if you placed your ear against the cold stone, you could still hear their heartbeats. The villages that once huddled near its shadow had grown into towns. Merchants came from distant lands, their caravans glinting with silk, tea, and porcelain. Along the wall, markets bloomed like spring flowers. Yet even among the laughter and trade, stories of the wall's origins never faded. Elders told their children about the days when the earth itself trembled under the weight of men and stone. In one such village lived an old man who had once been a yen guard upon the wall. His beard was white, his eyes soft as worn jade. Every evening, he would sit by the fire, telling stories to anyone who cared to listen, the stories of snowstorms that buried towers, of comrades who sang to the moon to keep warm, of the night when the fires of warning lit up the entire horizon. People say it was built to keep enemies out, he would murmur, his voice low and kind, but maybe it was also built to keep our courage in. His words always left a hush among the listeners. For they knew that courage was the mortar that truly held the wall together. Time, however, is a patient sculptor. Winds eroded the stones, rains washed away the carvings, and yet the wall endured. Scholars came from far and wide, measuring its length, tracing its history. Some called it a wonder, others a graveyard of dreams, but all agreed that it was unlike anything else on earth. Seasons changed endlessly as spring blossoms against the gray stones, autumn leaves carried by the wind, winters cloaking everything in silver frost. The wall witnessed it all. It had seen generations come and go, had watched as the world beyond it transformed, kingdoms turned into nations, and nomads into neighbors. One dawn, as the mist curled through the valleys, a group of young travelers arrived. They stood in silence, their eyes tracing the horizon where the wall met the sky. "Imagine," one whispered. "How many hands built this?" Another replied softly. "And how many hearts believed it was worth building?" The Great Wall had long ceased to be a weapon. It had become a memory carved into the landscape of time. Pilgrims still walked along its stones, not in armor, but in reverence. Some left flowers. Others bowed, as if greeting old friends. At night, when the moonlight poured over the stones, the wall looked alive once more. Shadows moved across its surface like ghosts of the past, and builders carrying stones, soldiers standing watch, torches flickering in the dark. It was as if time itself refused to let go. In the heart of the wall, in the silence between its stones, there lived a truth older than any empire, that unity and sacrifice can outlast even the mightiest of kingdoms. The Great Wall was not just built by hands, it was built by hearts that refused to surrender. And so, through centuries of wind and dust, the wall remained. The world around it changed, but it stood firm, watching, remembering. The dragon of stone never slept, it merely dreamed, waiting for the next dawn to rise above its ancient spine. When the last stone was set in place, and the final echo of hammer strikes faded across the northern hills, a strange silence descended upon the Great Wall. The wind that once carried the voices of thousands now brushed gently over the battlements, whispering stories of those who had labored, suffered, and dreamed beneath this endless sky. The soldiers stood on the towers, gazing across the horizon. The Mongolian plains stretched far into the distance, golden under the pale sunlight. Smoke rose faintly from nomadic camps, distant yet familiar, a reminder that the world beyond the wall still moved, breathed, and watched. For the people who had built it, the wall was no longer just stone and earth. It was memory turned into monument. Each brick bore the touch of calloused hands. Each gate carried the prayers of those who hoped their families might live in peace. And yet, peace was never permanent in the empire of men. As years passed, the wall became a living thing. Moss began to grow between the stones, and the footsteps of soldiers wore smooth paths along its length. New generations came, young men and women who had only heard tales of its construction. To them, the wall had always been their ancient and changing, eternal. On cold winter nights, the guards lit fires in iron braziers. They huddled around the glow, sipping warm millet wine and telling old stories of the first emperor's vision, of the countless workers who perished, of the generals who defended the frontier. Their laughter mingled with the crackling of the fire, and their voices rose into the night like forgotten prayers. Sometimes, when the moon hung low over the plains, travelers swore they saw shadows walking atop the wall, figures of long-dead laborers carrying stones, forever repeating their final task. The wind, too, seemed to sing for them, a mournful melody of toil and time. Centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell, but the wall remained. Kings changed, armies vanished, and cities turned to dust, yet the line of stone endured, stretching like the backbone of an ancient dragon across the land. Even as empires faded, the Great Wall stood watching, waiting, remembering. In spring, flowers bloomed between the cracks, softening the hard edges of the stones. Birds nested within the watchtowers, and children from nearby villages came to play on the old paths. The wall, once a boundary of fear and defense, had become a place of peace and memory. Travelers from distant lands arrived, tracing its path across mountains and deserts. They marveled at its scale, wondering how human hands could have shaped something so vast. Yet few understood the deeper truth, that the wall was not built by power alone, but by endurance, sacrifice, and dreams. And somewhere, beneath layers of earth and centuries of wind, The spirits of those who built it still lingered. They had become part of the land itself and the stones in the soil. In the sigh of the wind at dusk, their work, once burdened with pain, had turned into legacy. The Great Wall no longer divided, it united. It tied together generations, cultures, and stories. It became a bridge between past and present, a reminder that even the mightiest structures are built by mortal hands, guided by fleeting hopes. At sunset, the wall glowed red beneath the fading light, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. To anyone standing atop it, the view was timeless. The mountains, the plains, the shadows all unchanged, as if the centuries themselves bowed before the entrance of stone. And so, the Great Wall of China became more than a barrier. It became a story carved into the earth, a whisper from the past to those who would listen. It stood as proof that human determination, though fragile, could leave marks that outlast the ages. The wind carried its song across the centuries, gentle, eternal, and full of memory. And as the sun set behind the distant hills, the wall remained, watching the world it had helped shape, standing still beneath the stars,